We should start.
Okay.
Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of you, those who have joined IBPSA webinar. And as you know, this is a special edition we are having based on BSO 16 keynote address. I'm very glad that Ian Beausoleil-Morrison has agreed to repeat what he stated in UK couple of months back, and it's a very important topic he is going to deal with us today. On the topic is the world needs building energy simulation, and are we really ready for that or not? So again, I welcome you all, and I also welcome Ian. I will make him a presenter so you will be able to see his screen, and he will deliver session. As all of you know, that we generally have a session around 45-50 minutes, followed by questions and answers. So you can shoot your question on the question pane, and I will be moderating at the end of the session. Over to Ian.
Okay, thank you, Rajan. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. So thank you to Rajan for the introduction and in particular for organizing today's session. What I'd like to present today is a repeat of a keynote presentation that I gave at the Building Simulation and Optimization Conference that was held in Newcastle, England a couple of months ago. So to start off, I would like to make the case for why I believe the world needs building simulation, and I assume most of us who have tuned in today are working in the field of building simulation or studying in the field of building simulation. So I'd like to make the argument for why the world needs us, and also to make some recommendations or suggestions for what we need to do in order to respond to the world's needs. And I think a large driver for why the world needs building simulation has to do with climate change. It's a huge issue for our generations to deal with. Some people still deny that climate change is happening. Recent election of Donald Trump to the US is a notable person who doesn't believe in climate change, but I think the vast majority of us do. The evidence is becoming overwhelming. We don't need to look at climate models. We can just observe what's happening around us. And certainly this is data here from NASA that's showing how the Arctic ice cover has changed dramatically over the last 3 or 4 decades. And they're tracking this, other organizations are tracking this, but we see substantial changes with time, up to 13% or more decline per year in Arctic ice cover. The main driver of that climate change is anthropogenic, and there are natural forcings, of course, but the main driver is anthropogenic, and it's mostly due to the combustion of fossil fuels. And most of our energy use around the world is coming from fossil fuel sources, so this is tied very closely to our energy demand and consumption patterns. And this graph from the IPCC is quite shocking. If you look over on the right-hand side, you can see that, at least for me, for someone of my age, we can see that more than half of the carbon dioxide that's currently in our atmosphere has been added over my lifetime. And we are continuing to increase emissions and exacerbating the problem. So this is a huge driver for why we need to do something. And the world has been making efforts for the last 25, 30 years to address this. The most recent and significant one happened almost a year ago now at the COP21 meeting in Paris that led to an agreement between a large number of countries who have made pledges to address climate change. And the goals that they've stated in the signed agreement, which has now become adopted by many countries into law, is to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that will be a huge challenge for us. The agreement also has an aspirational target to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but I think most analysts who have looked at this in detail realize that that is an impossible goal at this point in time. Achieving the 2-degree target set out in the agreement is going to be a large challenge on its own. So in terms of approach, each country has made its own declaration to how it's going to reduce emissions. Various countries have made pledges. You know, for example, some have chosen 2005 as their reference year, and they're saying they're going to reduce emissions by 26% relative to 2005 or 30% relative to 2005. Others have chosen 1990 as a reference year, and others have chosen 2013 as a reference year. The reasons for choosing the reference year are often driven by politics and strategy, but the important thing is the levels of reductions that are claimed or intended by each participating country. And most of them amount to a roughly 1% reduction per year in emissions. So that's one part of the agreement is the reductions in emissions. The goal collectively is to reach global peak the global emissions as soon as possible within the next decade or two. And then this is a clause in the agreement that not that many people have been familiar with, is the clause to balance sources with sinks by the second half of the 21st century. So what they're implicitly saying there is that any emissions that we continue to add to the atmosphere will have to be balanced by the removal of emissions, and frankly we just don't have the technologies yet to do that, and that's a real aspirational target in the agreement. So we have this agreement. It's worth looking at our past efforts at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because efforts have been going on for 20 to 30 years in many parts of the world. This graph looks at how emissions have changed since 1970 for a handful of countries. And you can see in some cases, countries like Canada, the US, Australia, that have had growing populations have honestly struggled with reducing emissions. They've increased emissions relative to 1970, relative to 1990, relative to just about any reference year we choose. And we've seen some modest improvements in the last 5 to 10 years, but really modest improvements. Some of the European countries that have stagnant populations we've seen, and they've made great efforts to reduce emissions, have achieved some emissions reductions, but extremely modest. Most of them are not close to the 1% per year that are required to meet the intentions set out in the Paris Agreement. And if we look at graphs from other countries, we see quite similar trends. So what we're seeing is, looking around the world, is that the vast majority of countries are not on path to achieving the targets that they've set out in Paris. And what's worse than that is the UN has already analyzed the intended agreements that were set out in Paris, and they've analyzed that and said, if we're able to meet all of those targets, it's still not sufficient to meet the 2-degree warming target. And the third and most troubling point here is there's a clause in the Paris Agreement that says we're going to balance sources and sinks by the second half of this century, meaning that if we are to achieve the 2-degree warming target, we have to develop some new technology, and this might be some form of geoengineering, or it might be growing trees and then combusting them to produce energy and then capturing the carbon and sequestering it, doing things that we've started to imagine at this point, but we have not developed the technologies to do this at this point in time. So the reality is the Paris Agreement is not putting us on the trajectory to address the climate change that we need to. If we are to meet that target of 2-degree warming, countries are going to have to be far more ambitious in their declared targets. We're going to have to enhance them. So we're not doing enough to meet the current targets. We have to enhance those targets, and we can't rely on these carbon sinks that were talked about in the Paris Agreement. So how are we going to achieve this? This is a very ambitious target, something that we have to address. How are we going to achieve it? Well, it's worth looking at, because the problem is primarily driven by energy consumption. It's worth taking a look at how we currently are using energy, because this is leading to our emissions for the most part. This graph is United Kingdom data, but we see very similar pie charts for most OECD countries. And we see that in all cases, I think most of us are familiar with this, that residential and commercial buildings contribute to a large fraction of our energy consumption currently. In most cases, it's between 30 and up to 50% of a country's total energy consumption. So buildings are a big part of the problem, a big cause of our greenhouse gas emissions. They have to be a big part of the solution. If you look around the world, in most countries, at least in most countries that are heavy energy users, that our thermal demands dominate. And whether we're talking about a cold country like Canada, where I live, or a relatively warm country like Italy, we see that space heating and hot water heating demands dominate within our housing and commercial building sectors. So yes, electricity required for running appliances and lighting and cooling systems and ventilation systems is significant, but thermal energy demands dominate. So we need to set our minds towards how do we address some of these thermal energy demands. We've been doing a lot over past decades to try and address this, and the approach that we've taken in most countries is to enhance efficiencies by making better building envelopes, by improving the efficiency of combustion devices like boilers and furnaces and water heaters. There's been a lot of efforts to replace electric resistance heating with heat pumps to improve efficiency. So there's been lots of efforts in that regard. We could do more of that, but frankly, if we think back to the graphs that showed how we've changed emissions over time, we've had very modest impacts with all of these changes. It's been helpful, but certainly it's not enough on its own. Fuel switching is another possibility, and we've done a lot of that in the last 2 to 3 or 4 decades. In most OECD countries, the more carbon-intensive fossil fuels like fuel oil have been replaced with natural gas in large measure. So we've already switched, for the most cases, to the least greenhouse gas intensive fossil fuel, which is natural gas. We could switch to electricity, but this is only going to be helpful if we add emissions-free generation to the grid. And in most OECD countries, there's a handful of exceptions, but in most OECD countries, the electricity generation system is dominated by fossil fuel sources, coal in particular. So electrification is not going to be helpful unless we completely redevelop our electrical grid systems in most cases. We could turn to lifestyle changes. This is something that policy developers and politicians hate to deal with, but the fact is our desire to live in bigger and bigger spaces and consume more stuff is a big part of the problem. So lifestyle changes could be part of the solution, adapting the ways in which we live. And I think the fourth option is taking use and making greater use of locally available renewable energy sources, in particular solar energy, to address a lot of the energy demands of our building, in particular the thermal demands. So when it comes to solar, we have sort of the 3 classic options in solar are solar photovoltaics, passive solar, and active solar. So with solar photovoltaics, yes, we can do a lot with PV. There's been a great amount of take-up, especially in countries that have introduced feed-in tariff programs of photovoltaic systems, and that's been very helpful. There's been a lot of attention in recent years on so-called net zero buildings that try to generate as much electricity over the year through solar photovoltaics as they consume. That model, though, is not replicatable to a large scale because there is a significant temporal mismatch between when solar energy is available and when our buildings predominantly demand energy. So recall that the dominant energy needs in our buildings in most energy intensive using countries are thermal. So we need a lot of space heating and we need a lot of solar hot water heating. Those needs are greatest in the wintertime when solar energy is least available. So the idea that we can simply rely on the electrical grid to be some kind of infinite storage system for that energy is not replicable on a large scale. We need to address the storage problem. We need to address matching the times of demand of energy with when supply is available. And we need to deal with storage, whether that's storage in batteries or some kind of thermal storage systems. But we need to address that. And that means that the operation of buildings and the building energy systems will have to become much more complex than we've envisaged so far. Passive solar is something that, of course, humans have been making use of passive solar concepts for many thousands of years. But there are limits to how much we can exploit passive solar by traditional techniques of using some exposed thermal mass and relying on an uncontrolled thermal storage system to try to match supply and demand periods. In modern, well-insulated buildings, we rarely have space heating demands during times of peak passive solar availability. So if we're looking on the right-hand side of this, you can see this is an example of a house with a large south-facing glazing area. There are times when the passive gains through the windows of that house exceed the peak heating demand of the building. And there are other times when the passive solar gains are non-existent or minimal. So again, we have to deal, if we want to greater exploit passive solar gains, we need to deal with that temporal mismatch. The conventional approach is to shade windows for certain times of the year, or to limit, in particular, to limit the amount of south-facing glazing. But that sacrifices a lot of potential passive solar gains. And there are techniques that could be utilized. So for example, integrating active energy systems with the passive systems, using radiant heating and cooling in flooring systems coupled to heat pumps and thermal storage offers potential for greater utilization of passive solar gains to reduce space heating and hot water heating demands. But now we're talking about buildings with energy systems that are more complex to design, and certainly more complex to operate. Active solar is something, again, that's been around for a good period of time. The classic approach is to use solar thermal collectors coupled to some kind of diurnal storage, typically in a water tank located in a building's basement or mechanical room. And we can heat up the water with a solar collector and then use that water to supply space heating or hot water heating demands when the building requires it. But that has limits because that thermal storage systems allow us to deal with temporal mismatches on a diurnal basis. So let's say we have solar energy available in the daytime, we need a thermal demand at night. That storage can work okay in that situation. However, in the Northern Hemisphere, our space heating demands are strongest between November and March, and we have relatively little solar energy availability during that period of time. We have excess solar energy available in the summer period. So if we can capture and store excess solar energy that's available in the summertime to make use in the wintertime, that offers great potential for increasing the amount of active solar we use to offset space and water heating needs. And we can do it. There's been a number of examples where it's been done. There's active research going on in these topic areas. But again, it makes buildings more complicated to design, and certainly more complicated to operate. So our future buildings, if we are to address climate change, our future buildings are going to have to become much more complex because we need to radically reduce our energy consumption. Our existing approaches, our classic approaches of going to more energy efficiency, more insulation, tighter building code requirements, more efficiency, all of that is helpful, but it's not going to achieve the levels of reductions that are required. So one option is to use more on-site solar energy, but we're going to have to deal with much more complex designs and a much more complex operation of buildings to achieve this. So how are we going to design these buildings? How are we going to operate these buildings? Well, this is where we come to building simulation. Last year, Joe Clark published a vision statement in the Journal of Building Performance Simulation. And this was something he was requested to develop this vision statement by IBPSA's board of directors. And his vision statement was endorsed by IBPSA's board of directors. So you can think of this as IBPSA's vision for the future of building simulation. And in this, Joe Clark talks about how building simulation has the potential to allow us to examine complex energy systems, energy conversion and storage systems, and interactions with building systems at the design stage to allow us to design novel concepts to allow us to compare them to find the most cost-effective solutions. And also importantly, building simulation offers the potential to be used at the operational stage, where we can better operate buildings to achieve maximum efficiency, to detect faults when they arise, and to trigger alarms when faults are detected. So we have the potential there, yes. However, we're nowhere close to realizing that potential at this current point in time. So building simulation can be used at many stages of a building's life cycle, at early stages of research into novel systems, at early design stages, at detailed design stages. It can be used in the commissioning phase, and it can be used in the operational stage for model predictive control, for example, or fault detection and diagnostics. However, what we find, although there are many success stories in all of those stages of the building's life cycle, many success stories of the application of BPS to those stages, what we find is that in the vast majority of cases around the world, we are using building simulation post-design. We're using a post-design to demonstrate that a design complies with some building regulations or building code, or to achieve some kind of label like a LEED label. So all the decisions have already been taken about the building's design. Building simulation is not affecting those design decisions. It's merely reporting upon them. And there's very few applications of building simulation post that design stage as well. So we're really not exploiting the full potential of building simulation at this point in time to improve building design or to improve building operation. So why is that? Why can't we break through that barrier? Because this is not a new observation. This is something that we've been observing for a long period of time. And there's lots of reasons. Yes, we are dealing with a conservative industry for the most part. The classic split incentive problems hasn't gone away, where people taking decisions are often not the ones who are living with the buildings or paying the energy bills in the end. Our design sequences are often still segregated. There's no integration between or iteration between design professionals in many cases. And there are many non-technical barriers. A very interesting article published earlier this year by Sarah El-Sadani and Clarice Blais de Souza discussed some of these non-technical barriers, questions about who controls the decision-making process. Do professions trust each other? Fee structures, all of these issues lead to complications and impediments for the use of building simulation. But I believe that in many cases, some of these are more excuses as opposed to reasons. I think fundamentally, there are many players in the building process and in the decision-making process that simply don't trust building simulation results. So I think we have very much a trust issue. And if that were addressed, I think we would be able to address a lot of these barriers previously mentioned. So I think we do have this credibility gap. A lot of people just don't trust building simulation results. And I think we need to ask ourselves as a discipline, we need to ask, as a community, we need to ask ourselves, is it because we're not using the right tools? We don't have the right tools? We have too many of them? We have too few? Or is it because of those of us who are using the tools? Are we qualified to operate them properly? So let's take a look at both of these aspects. In terms of the tools, for example, I don't think anybody would claim we have too few building simulation tools. We have a lot of building simulation tools at our disposal. There are many tools, some geared towards researchers, some geared towards architectural practitioners, some geared towards HVAC engineers, many options available to us. If you look at the Building Energy Software Tools Directory that's maintained by the US chapter of IBPSA, you can see dozens and dozens, if not more than 100 simulation tools listed. And that's a lot of tools. And compare that to the way we use the web for conducting searches. There are billions of searches done around the world every day, web searches done around the world. And how many tools do we have available to us to do that? Well, there's a fair number of tools available, but how many are actually used? A small handful, 3 or 4 that have any significant usage. So billions of web searches done every day with a small handful of tools. I don't think we're doing billions of building simulations every day, yet we have dozens or more than 100 tools. So why do we have so many building simulation tools? Does it make sense? Is that diversity actually hampering us? Is it a problem? Well, it's worth looking back at history to understand, to help us understand why we have such a large array of building simulation tools available to us. And it's interesting to look back at some of the old publications to our field, because there are some gems of wisdom to be found there. People were thinking about many of these issues decades earlier in many cases. This is a schematic from a paper published by Jeff Hirsch at the 1985 Building Simulation Conference. So this was the first conference to call itself Building Simulation, and it was held before IBPSA was even formed, and it was a genesis for the formation of IBPSA actually. But looking at this schematic from Jeff Hirsch, we can see that people back 30 plus years ago had a very good understanding of the physical phenomena that were happening in buildings and energy systems. They understood all the fundamental heat and mass transfer processes that were happening. They could sketch them all out. They could write all the equations. They understood how to treat long-wave radiation exchange and conductive heat transfer and convective heat transfer. They understood all those fundamentals. They could write out a set of partial differential equations that were highly coupled and nonlinear. They could write out all the math, but they simply didn't have the computational power necessary to resolve those equations with a high degree of accuracy, or high degree of fidelity, let me say. And back then in the 1960s, the computational power they had available to them through mainframe computers was significantly less than most of us have today in our phones that we carry around with us. So they had to make some simplifications, or to render that complexity to a level of something that could be solved with the computational power they had at hand. And in the earliest building simulation programs, one of the key decisions that was made in many tools was to sequentially solve, to break the problem up into pieces. So to treat the heat and mass transfer processes happening in the building domain separately from the HVAC domain, and to communicate information back and forth between these domains, but to decouple them somewhat. And those decisions we're still living with today in many of our tools that we're still operating with. There was some brilliant work done by Don Stevenson and Gint Metalis, who brought the response factor method that had been developed in other domains. They brought that to the buildings domain. And this allowed the pre-calculation of many of the equations before time-step simulations were performed. So for example, they were able to predetermine how a space might respond to some triangular pulse input of an excitation. Maybe that would be solar radiation absorbed on a floor, or an internal gain from a person. They could pre-calculate how the building would respond. And we don't see triangular pulses in reality very often, but they showed that realistic boundary conditions could be represented by a series of triangular pulses. So this blue line here represents, say, a temperature boundary condition, maybe the temperature on the outside of a wall surface, for example, over a period of time. And then we could have one triangular pulse that represents that blue line at time 1. And then we have other triangular pulses that represent that actual boundary condition at other points of time. And if we add all of those triangular pulses together, what we see is the red line, which gives a close approximation to the actual boundary condition. And why the triangular pulses? Well, they could perform Laplacian transforms on triangular pulses. And it meant that the thermal response of the space could be resolved to a simple algebraic summation. So rather than having to resolve partial differential equations in a building simulation tool, it could be a simple algebraic summation. And that saved a huge amount of computational power. Now that imposed some restrictions. We had to impose restrictions of linearity and time invariance of properties such as convective heat transfer coefficients, but it allowed them to resolve that complex set of equations to something that was substantially simpler and possible to calculate with the computers they had at hand. So they could pre-calculate a building's response to a number of thermal excitations like passive solar gains, internal gains from people, transient conduction through wall assemblies, etc., and linearly add them all up. And this led to great computational savings, but we also imposed a lot of limitations on what we could resolve. We had to impose a lot of assumptions that are buried in the simulation tools in many cases that we still use today. And in many cases, users aren't aware of those kinds of simplifications. So many different modeling approaches were developed for treating long-wave radiation exchange, solar transmission, air infiltration, etc. And building simulation tools were developed along certain paths. And in many cases, because of the monolithic nature of these tools, it wasn't possible to pick and choose modeling methods from various domains and put them together. Once a certain development path had been chosen for a particular tool, they had to stick to that development path. Which is why today we're still living with a lot of the assumptions that were taken back in the 1960s and 1970s. We have a great deal of computer code that's still developed at those points in time, and we're still living with some of those decisions that were made because computational efficiency was absolutely critical back then. So we have great diversity in modeling methods, but does it really matter? Is that a problem for us? Well, I personally don't think so. I think this diversity in modeling approaches is actually quite healthy in our domain. We have developed things like the ASHRAE standard 140, a standard method of test for evaluating building simulation programs that has a series of test cases, and many of these were derived from earlier work done through the International Energy Agency. And simple test cases like the one shown here, which is a simple shoebox with 2 windows, and well defined in an unambiguous way so that that building can be modeled by any number of simulation tools. And what we're showing on this bar graph here are the results from 8 very well experienced users of 8 different simulation tools who predicted the performance of this shoebox building with 2 windows. And what we can see if we compare the red bars, which is the annual space heating load on that shoebox, we can see that, yes, there is a difference between these individual simulation tools, but the spread is maybe 15 or 20%. And the blue bars represent the cooling load difference. And again, there's a spread between these simulation tools, and again, about something 15 to 20%. So yes, there are differences between these simulation tools because of all the modeling assumptions, because of all the decisions that were taken decades ago. But that's not a great deal of disagreement between tools, and I think we can certainly live with that. It's interesting to compare that amount of disagreement with the amount of disagreement we see when we compare individual users. This graph here now is looking at simulation results from 21 people who were simulating that same shoebox building, case 600. They're using 2 different simulation tools here. And again, you can see the annual space heating and the annual space cooling predictions from these 21 users. The dashed lines on the graph are representing the ranges that were established from the experienced users who used the 8 tools back here that are published in the appendix of the ASHRAE standard. So we would expect all of these users should have results that fall within those dashed lines. And what we can see from this is that very few of the users' results fall within those dashed lines. So what's going on here? Well, these are students. These are students who are taking a simulation course with me. And these are, in most cases, this is the first time most of these students are using a simulation tool. And they were all successful in generating results with their simulation tools. But as you can see from the results presented here, not so successful at predicting what we would call accurate answers. So why is that? Well, I guess it's easy to dismiss this and say, these are novice users, these are students, they don't have the experience, they're not skilled at applying these tools. That's one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is maybe I didn't teach them very well. That's a possibility. But we do have a great deal of of disagreement between the students here. Now, let's compare that graph to this one. This is another case altogether. This was an interesting study that was done in California a couple of years ago, where 12 professional BPS users, so these are people who make their living either entirely or partially from applying building simulation, and they were all given the same specifications and drawings for a building and asked to predict its gas consumption and electricity consumption over a 1-year period. And each line on these graphs, gas on the left, electricity on the right, each line represents the results from a single user. So recall, these are professionals, they're not student, they're not novice users. We would expect a fair bit of agreement between these. We would expect that most of them would predict more or less the same gas consumption or electricity consumption. And we can see a great deal of diversity in these predictions here. So compare that spread to that. And I'm not sure that the students have greater disagreement than the professionals. Here's another example from a different study altogether again. This was some work done through the IEA, the Annex 58, the Energy Conservation in Buildings program, an empirical validation study. This was a research house at Fraunhofer in Germany that was, in this case, was controlled to a constant temperature, and the graph is plotting on the vertical axis the heat input to maintain that house at a constant temperature. And what you can see here are 21 individual teams. These are research teams, so these are not practitioners who maybe are rushed in doing their work or don't have the budget to spend a lot of time on performing a simulation. These are researchers that we could argue maybe have the luxury of time to do an analysis in greater detail. They're not novice users for the most part, they're experienced users. And 21 teams were asked to predict the performance, the heat injection to this building. And there's two graphs here. 10 of the users' results are plotted on the left graph, and 11 of them are plotted on the right graph. And on both cases, the solid black line represents the experimental or the measured heat input rate. And we would expect quite close agreement between the simulation predictions and the experimental results. And we can see for some of the teams that they predicted quite closely, but we also see a great amount of diversity in those simulation predictions. So let's go back for a second and say, here's the diversity we get between individual simulation programs. Yes, there is some diversity, but not a huge amount. Here's the kind of diversity we get between individual users, student, novice users, BPS professionals, and research teams. And I think most of us will look at those graphs and say, wow, the user is the biggest uncertainty in all this. And this is not a new observation. This is, again, going back to, this is one of the papers that was presented again at the Building Simulation 85 conference, Linda Laurie's work, where she talked about how the designer has shown to be the key to calculated energy consumptions. The user is the biggest source of uncertainty, is what she was noting here. And this hasn't changed. So why has this not changed in decades? Why is the user still the biggest source of uncertainty in applying these tools? Well, I will argue that we're trying to convince ourselves that this is an easy thing to do, and the reality is it's not. Here's some quotes here from 3 particular tool developers. I'm not picking on these 3 tool developers. I think many similar claims are made by others. Tool A, for example, talks about if you're using the wizard mode of operation of their tool, that virtually no experience with energy analysis is necessary. Tool B is going to do all the hard work for you. You don't have to be an expert. Tool C is saying energy analysis made easy. We're trying to convince ourselves that this is an easy thing to do, but the reality is it's not. There really are no shortcuts to developing proficiency at performing building simulations accurately. It's extremely easy to train someone to operate a tool. I've done it many times myself in the past, and I won't do it again, but in half a day I can train just about anybody to push the right buttons and pull the right levers to make the gears turn on a simulation tool to produce some results. And when we do that, this is the kind of thing that happens. Yes, it's really easy to drive one of these tools and get numbers out, but producing accurate results is extremely difficult. And I will argue that we're not equipping the users of the tools with enough knowledge of the fundamentals to operate them effectively. So in order for people to operate these tools effectively, they have to understand the algorithms that are hidden in those tools. They have to understand the assumptions that were made sometimes decades ago and simplifications that were made in developing those tools. Understand what are the default inputs, what are the default calculation methods, which of them are hidden, which do I have control over, which inputs are going to make the biggest impact upon the results. What are the physics that are represented, and importantly, what are the physics that are not? How do I choose which tool is right for which task? How do I choose which alternate methods are right for which task? How do I look at my results and scrutinize them and convince myself that they are reasonable? These are really hard things to train somebody to do. In order to do this, I think we need to collectively reform the way that we're teaching building simulation. I think in many cases we are training people to operate tools, not to understand. We're not educating them on the fundamentals. So I think whether we're talking about continuing professional development or university education, I think we need to look at the ways that we're teaching. What I've been trying in the last couple of years in my teaching is to use an experiential learning approach where exposing students to the underlying theories and at the same time having them actively experiment with simulation tools, and then collectively performing what we call autopsies to analyze results and really dig down and understand what the tools are doing with the inputs that they're providing. There's some papers that are written on these teaching approaches. If you're interested, I can point you towards them. I think it's important too that we teach building simulation in a tool agnostic fashion, so that we're not training somebody to use a single tool, that we're equipping them with the knowledge they need so that they can easily learn how to operate any individual tool. And I think this is critical, absolutely critical for our domain, building simulation domain, to develop the credibility that we need in order to make a difference, to be believed by the other players in the building field, so that they will have faith in what we're doing. Excuse me, I hit the wrong button there. So I think we need to reform the way we teach building simulation. I think we also need to keep improving our models. Tamami Kasuda made a very interesting observation 30-some years ago in a paper. And he said one cannot help wondering whether all of this meaning the development of simulation methods, is leading to, are we going too far? Should we just say we've done enough, we're accurate enough, we've got enough resolution? And so he wasn't a question that he was answering, it was a question that he was posing. And my response to that question is no, we still have some work to do in some of the important heat and mass transfer processes in terms of improving our modeling approaches. We still have some development works to do in many cases. Something that we have really lacked as a domain is doing enough validation. There certainly have been many very useful and helpful and creative methods developed for validating. We looked at the ASHRAE standard 140. That's encapsulated many of the validation developments that have happened over the decades, but it's lagging at least 20 or 30 years behind developments. We need to do far more in validation. This graph on the right-hand side is an example of a recent study that my group was involved in, where we took a detailed look at radiant floor models that were used in 3 building simulation tools. And just by looking, we were able to find major flaws in the models used in all of those tools. We didn't do anything particularly difficult or magical. We just took the time to look in detail, to develop some test cases, to analyze them and contrast results. And I think there's many, many others models in other tools and in different types of models that have been left unexplored for so long that we really need to catch up in the validation front. Now, I mentioned that in many cases, we're still using simulation tools that have code that was written in the 1970s and early as the 1960s in some cases. We have a tremendous endowment. There's been decades worth of development work that's been done on some of these models and some of these tools. And because of their monolithic nature, it's difficult to extract certain models from certain tools and use them in others. And I think we're going to live with that for a very long time because of the huge effort that has gone into those developments. There is work going on through IEA annexes, Annex 60 in particular, which has led to IBPSA project number 1, where they're looking at new modeling languages and paradigms, and all of those things will make useful contributions, but it is not going to replace the fact that we're going to be living with some of these existing tools for many years to come. So we need to continue these kinds of developments, but also continue to develop the existing tools that we have. So in summary, I think I would like to argue that we need to achieve very deep reductions in building energy use. It's critical if we're going to address climate change. Doing more of the same is not going to reach our objectives. As a result, I think future buildings are going to become much more complex to design and much more complex to operate. And I think we need building simulation in order for us to achieve those goals. And we have a lot to do to get ready. So collectively as a community, we have a lot to do in terms of model development, validation, new computational methods. But one of the things that we really need to focus on is the way that we're educating our users of these tools. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. I request audience to post questions so that I can either unmute them and they can ask question directly, or either if audio is not very clear, I can pass on the message to Ian and he can reply. Any questions from the audience? We have one from a person called Kumar, and he's asking which simulation tool is better for modeling heat, air, and moisture flows. Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I heard the question, Rajan.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. It really depends greatly on what the objectives of the analysis are, whether it's to look at material degradations, whether it's to look at thermal comfort conditions. It really depends. There are no simple answers to these tools. There's, I think, a tendency for us to want to contrast the capabilities of one tool against the other, and to do it in a fairly simple way where we just have tick marks against modeling capabilities, and we can count up the ones that have the most tick marks and say that's the best tool. And I don't think it's that simple. I think it really depends greatly on the modeling task at hand. And I believe strongly that we need to educate people to understand the fundamentals of how these tools are operating so that they can easily make the choice about which tool might be right for a given situation. And I also believe that people should be capable, if they're considered to be building simulation experts, they should be capable of using multiple tools, because there is no one tool that is the best for all situations.
Okay, thank you. There are quite a few questions now coming up. Before I pass on any question, I request audience to translate question into English, because I will not be able to comprehend anything which you, although you're writing English script, but I might not be able to figure it out what. So please translate and send a question. There are quite a few, so let me unmute Jason. Jason, would it be okay if I unmute you and you can ask a question? So Jason Glazer, just hold on, let me find the name. Yeah, Jason, you can ask a question to Ian directly. I have unmuted you. Jason, can you hear me? Okay. Jason Glazer is asking, do you think that certifications such as ASHRAE's BEMP should be required for all professional modelers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think ASHRAE has developed the Building Energy Modeling Professional certification scheme. I think is very useful. I think schemes like this are very helpful, and should it be used universally? I'm not sure. I haven't taken the BEMP course or exam myself, so I can't answer whether or not it addresses all of the important things related to building simulation, but I can see it as definitely being a helpful way of assessing whether somebody has gathered sufficient knowledge to use these tools effectively. And I would like to see schemes like BEMP adopted or developed in other jurisdictions as well, because certainly some of the aspects are probably more related to large commercial buildings in the US and HVAC systems that might be more pertinent to US climates than some other parts of the world.
Okay, thanks. Jason doesn't probably. Jason, I think that's enough to explain or to answer your question. Let me go on to another person, and so there is a question from quite a few people about the recording. Yes, this recording would be available on YouTube channel, IBPSA's education channel on YouTube. You will be able to see that probably after 3 or 4 days. We have a question from Anna Martin. Anna, I am just unmuting you, and you can ask question. I have unmute you, Annie. Go ahead.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I was wondering, you were talking about the user differences, which is really interesting. And I've noticed that when users generally look at whether the simulation has come out correctly, it's usually just to do with unmet hours, rather than actually going in and checking that your air handling unit is working correctly, you've got the right amount of fresh air going through, your radiant floors are working correctly. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the user's understanding, first of all, how to check their model, and also on the tools being able to give you those checks so that you understand more fully results that are coming out of the model. What your thoughts on that are?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think most of us who are using these tools probably place too much faith in them. And once they produce results, we often will accept the metric that we're interested in, whether that be the annual energy consumption or the number of unmet hours. We would accept that without sufficiently scrutinizing. And this is something in my teaching approach I try to address by doing what we call simulation autopsies with the students, where we'll take a model that's submitted by a student and they've perhaps been asked to submit a peak heating load or a peak temperature or a annual space heating load result, and we'll look at their models and we'll try to understand, does the solar gain transmitted through a window on a particular day make sense? Does it agree with their rough calculations? Do the peak temperatures make sense? Does the ground reflected solar radiation make sense? And look at some of the individual results to first convince themselves that the model is well constructed, that they've given an accurate description of the building, because the building's predictions should agree with simple hand calculations in many cases, or at least in the right order of magnitude. So that's something I try to impress a great deal upon the students, is not accepting the results without doing a great deal of scrutiny firsthand. And I think most simulation tools, at least the ones that I use, allow the user to dig down into some very detailed results that allow this kind of checking.
Thank you. We have one question from a person called Lago Caporino Figueria, and the person is asking that Do you think that Modelica will have a key role in building simulation?
I hate predicting the future because I'm always wrong. um, I think if you look at existing building simulation tools, they contain many models to consider some of the important heat and mass transfer processes. Things like sky reflected diffuse radiation, ground reflected radiation, transmission through window assemblies or absorption on individual sheets of glass, air infiltration models, etc., etc., etc. Many of these will require redevelopment in a Modelica environment before Modelica can really be have sufficient modeling capabilities to accurately model building physics and HVAC systems. So I think that's many years, if not decades, away from being realized. It's possible, but really Modelica is just another programming approach, and it's not a modeling environment. It doesn't come with a set of models. There are some libraries that have been developed, but if you look at the contents of those libraries, they're far away from having the full list of capabilities you can find in some of the mature building simulation tools. So maybe one day, but it's a long way off. Were there other questions, Rajan? Hello?
Yeah, so there are multiple general questions people are asking regarding what tool do you use, or how do you convince client to use building simulations, and so on and so forth. So probably I will request them to see some references, or I can send some references, but we wish to focus a little bit more on the topic itself. There are also questions coming on TMY files and how do you really use that, whether they're valid or not. So again, I would request that we had a webinar on weather files and weather data. You can, and this recording is available on a channel. You can look at that. So I have one question from Matu D. Antoni, and let me unmute the person and then let her ask a question. Just hold on for a minute. Yes, Matteo Antoni, you may go ahead and ask question. Hello, can you hear us? You are muting yourself from your side, so you need to unmute. Okay, let me on behalf of the person, let me ask. I would like to know some comments on energy system modeling. Most of the times, the simulation topic has not right attention from simulators.
So the question is on, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's, for me, it's a little difficult to figure it out what the question is, but the person is typing, and I'm just reading verbatim, that I would like to know some comments on energy system modeling. Most of the times, this simulation topic has not the right attention from simulators.
So is this referring now to energy conversion and storage systems, HVAC systems?
I suppose, yes. I'm unmuting, Macho. Can you hear us? Anyway, so let's skip this question for a while. And I think that was last question we had on the topic. If we don't have any other question, probably we can wrap up the seminar. Yes, I don't see any new question coming up on the webinar. So thank you very much for attending the webinar. all of you, and we'll keep offering you another quality webinars on IBPSA platform. And please watch out for such special edition webinars as well from the thought leaders of building performance simulations. I also thank Ian for his time and efforts in preparing and sharing his thought about simulation and future and why do we really need that. Recording of this would be available on a YouTube channel in 4 or 5 days from now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian, again.
Okay, thank you.